So in the last unit, we looked at reward sensitivity and how alterations in reward sensitivity might increase motivation, drive to seek out a rewarding substance like food potentially. And it's important to remember, just because we have a reward drive to something, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to do it. That said, it's kind of hard when that drive feels very potentially strong. And although you can't at this moment in time really alter your reward circuitry, the one thing we do have is some of this executive control over what our actual behavior is. So just because we feel motivated to seek out a particular reward, it doesn't mean we're actually going to do that. And the part of our brain that really influences that is this frontal part of our brain, part of our frontal lobe, that exerts this cognitive control, this executive control over our behaviors. Now, I'm choosing my words carefully here, and I want to be careful here because I'm trying to say, oh, you can have control, and sometimes we often say with individuals with obesity is, oh, they just don't have any self-control. And the question is how much of that self-control can you force? How much can you consistently override that drive to consume? And I have to be careful as well because they're not the same thing. But if I look at drug-seeking behavior, of course, an individual can override the drive to consume that particular drug. They could technically, they have the executive function to do that. But that reward stimulus might be so high that regardless of their goals, their plans, their desires, right, their thinking desires to overcome that rewarding stimuli, it can be very profoundly difficult to kick. Okay, and I'm not saying food is a drug. I'm just saying that when we talk about things like control, it's maybe not as simplistic as we might make it seem. And as we're going to see in this unit, we don't all have maybe the same levels of control over our food consumption as you might think. Okay, so let's explore this concept. So when I say cognitive control, like I mentioned, I'm talking about my frontal lobe. I'm talking about intentionally selecting behaviors, thoughts, or emotions within a particular context. So like forcing yourself, like thinking. We're talking about thinking brain, right? Which is influenced by internal states and a lot of other things. But we're thinking about this like executive ability to be able to kind of make decisions and move towards those particular states. Okay. And although you might make plans like I'm going to stick to this diet or I'm going to exercise every day, I'm going to do these things, levels of cognitive control in the moment, they're hard to predict. Right? So you might have great plans to study hard for your next test, but in the moment, there might be a lot of other things that are competing with that cognitive control. Okay? So with respect to uncontrolled eating behavior or non-homeostatic appetite, if an individual has lower cognitive control, first and foremost, that is not a moral judgment, right? There could be anatomical and physiological differences with that individual. That it's not a failing of character. First and foremost, I want to say that, okay? But some individuals might have lower cognitive control over their ability to eat and a higher reward sensitivity, and that together, and add stress, add emotions into that as well, might make it even more difficult to resist something that's potentially really appetizing, like something that's high in sugar, fat, and sodium. Okay, so when we talk about control, executive control, we often talk about the prefrontal cortex, and I wanted to kind of highlight some of the areas of the prefrontal cortex that are associated with feeding behavior and that can be compromised in individuals or may change in individuals with obesity. So in this image here, we see a whole brain image from the exterior, and you get a sense of where the dorsolateral DL prefrontal cortex is, okay? In order to see what's called the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, I need this sagittal view right here. So I have to kind of split the brain in two and look at it from like a lateral view, okay? from the inside of the brain. And then you get a better sense of that dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Okay, so just localizing these in the brain. The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex has been more shown to be associated with upregulation, so increasing your desire to seek out food, whereas the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has been more associated with the downregulation of appetite. Okay. So why does that matter? Well, individuals with binge eating disorder, which is part of non-homeostatic appetite or uncontrolled eating, if we want to call it that, individuals with binge eating disorder and other forms of obesity often have lower activity in their prefrontal cortex overall, and potentially specifically in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, so if we have a downregulation in the part of the brain that decreases appetite, that might promote an increase in appetite. So again, that executive control that's going to help me override maybe all those other factors that are making me want to eat, that might be compromised in individuals with obesity. Another area of the brain that's associated with eating behavior, which is close to the regions I just talked about, is something called the orbitofrontal cortex. So orbital, we're talking about the orbits, right, where our eye sockets are. They are our eye sockets, basically. So above and behind those eye sockets, that part of the brain is an important area for decision making. And this part of the brain is going to receive taste responsive neuronal projections from the insular cortex, which is part of our, it's kind of in part of the sensory motor integration pathways. It does lots of things and we don't totally know what the insula does, but that's part of what it does. And we believe that this orbitofrontal cortex helps us predict how rewarding food will be and to influence behavior in a particular direction. So, for instance, like putting a lot of this stuff together, you might see food and that's coming in through your various sensory apparati and that information's made sense of. Most of that information goes to the thalamus as well, which is our main sensory processing area. And so you see food, you smell food, you hear food, you think of food too. That information comes in, and then based on that information, our orbitofrontal cortex may help us decide, well, how rewarding, also with information from our reward circuitry as well, how rewarding do I believe that food will actually be, right? So I see chocolate cake, I see it, I have memories of it, hippocampus, my reward network might kick in as well, my reward circuits might kick in as well, and my orbitofrontal cortex, it's part of that predicting that value of the food, okay? And what's interesting is they find that when for instance, you have people to smell an odor of food, that the orbitofrontal cortex lights up, right, to when it's kind of something that could be really rewarding. But the more someone smells the same kind of odor, so let's say you smell chocolate, it might feel really rewarding at first, but as you keep smelling it, that desirability goes down. Right? If we apply that to actual desire to consume food, that's something called sensory specific satiety, that when we keep smelling or tasting the same things, our desire for that same thing goes down over time. And it is believed that the orbitofrontal cortex is part of this pathway. So it helps to predict the rewarding value of food, and it helps to maybe say, well, I've had enough of this type of food. I don't want any more, because it's no longer novel. It's no longer as rewarding. Okay? Unsurprisingly, as we keep seeing over and over again, individuals with obesity have been shown to have decreased or changed orbitofrontal gray matter volume, which again might affect their ability to exert control over or to properly process those rewarding stimuli in a way that they can exert more control over them. Okay, but we have to be careful assuming too much from a statement like that last one there. We just know that there's differences in this area, perhaps in individuals with obesity. So in this slide, I don't expect you to remember all of your neuroimaging from anatomy. That's not what I'm trying to do here. But what I want to show you is that differences in activations in different brain regions, there is a correlation with BMI. And these brain regions that are highlighted on this slide are also implicated in appetite, in feeding behavior, as well as executive control, which is what this unit is about. And with different activations in the prefrontal cortex, with higher activation in the prefrontal cortex, we see a negative association with BMI. So again, I like to ask the question here, like, how much control do we really have over feeding behavior? Is this really all under conscious control? Can you force yourself to have more cognitive control? And how much does that actually work? I think, I know many individuals with obesity, and I know many people that have struggled with their weight, and they really try hard to control their eating behavior, but they have a hard time with that control, especially, again, like I said, if there is a lot of rewarding stimuli or they feel really driven by these reward-seeking behaviors. So just adding another level of complexity to that concept of cognitive control over feeding behavior. So this next slide just kind of summarizes something that I have been suggesting, which is that cognitive control, which is mainly from the prefrontal cortex, that can help to override some of that valuation of a particular reward, like ice cream, let's say, right? So we have the cue of ice cream. We perceive it both through our visual stream, but also through olfactory sensation as well. And then obviously memory plays into that as well, but let's not go there, right? We evaluate that, which is in part due to the ventral median prefrontal cortex, but also really implicated by something called the ventral striatum, which I haven't specifically talked about, but that's really a central part of our reward pathway. Really think ventral striatum, think reward pathway, okay? So we see a reward, we perceive it, we value it out, and then perhaps our prefrontal cortex can override our desire to consume that reward, okay? However, some people might not have the same potential to override that reward, and that reward sensitivity might be higher, which might promote differences in what that person actually does and whether they actually seek out food. So to add to this concept of that I've been talking about of maybe not having as much of that cognitive control as well as a higher reward sensitivity, those are concepts that are sometimes talked about under the construct of impulsivity, right? So impulsivity is this increased rash spontaneous behavior. So for instance, you're not thinking about food at all, and then someone comes home with ice cream, and you're like, oh my God, you need to get it, and you seek it out right away. It's like, oh my God, I have to get it right away. And someone with impulsivity, they're maybe constantly seeking out rewards in a rasher manner, even though those rewards may compromise the goals that they have set. Okay, so this impulsivity might be part of this combination between something I've been talking about as far as that heightened reward related motivation and a heightened state of disinhibition. I hate this word, disinhibition. It feels very hard to process because it's kind of a double negative there, right? So disinhibition, inhibition is like stopping yourself from eating. Disinhibition means you can't stop yourself from eating. Okay, so heightened disinhibition means like that cognitive control that you're quote unquote supposed to have is not able to override what's going on, right? Which leads someone to seek out food more than anything else. And in this study here, the systematic review of 20 experimental studies, they found that in binge eating disorder, which is often believed to be marked by that impulsivity, they argue that binge eating disorder is like a subtype of that's often found within obesity that is characterized by this higher impulsivity, right? So in obesity, an individual might have higher reward sensitivity, But in binge eating disorder, as one area of uncontrolled eating and of non-homeostatic appetite, it's this rash, spontaneous behavior, or the inability to and this inability to inhibit, so this disinhibition, that's promoting that, lack of control. That's what we talked about in binge eating disorder, that lack of control that causes them to seek them out. Okay. So as it says, their food-specific reward sensitivity is increased in individuals with obesity without binge eating disorder, but maybe not as much in those individuals with binge eating, which again, what does this all mean to me? Is that when we are dealing with any client, any person, any friend, any family member that struggles with anything, we can't assume that we know what they're going through, and we can't assume that we know what all individuals with obesity are dealing with. Right? And there's many different ways, there's many different obese phenotypes within the obese phenotype, right? There's different ways that disease, the behaviors that lead to that disease manifest. And one of those is binge eating disorder, which very much correlated with obesity, that perhaps is another level of dysregulation of this non-homeostatic or uncontrolled eating construct. Really, really interesting. And so to bring this together with some of the other things I've been talking about, remember, this slide just gives another image of that reward pathway. We see our ventral tegmental area, we see the nucleus accumbens, and our frontal cortex as well. And what this slide is again arguing is that in this impulsivity, it's kind of this combination between this lower cognitive control and heightened reward sensitivity that's causing these impulsive behaviors towards food. Okay? How do we change that? Well, that's really individual, right? That's really going to depend on that person, and there are cognitive behavioral strategies, there are pharmacological approaches, there's psychiatric approaches, there's behavioral approaches, but it really, honestly, the success with treatment is really going to depend on the individual and their relationship with their healthcare provider as well. But just again, adding another thing into the mix of how complex appetite is and how many things are going on and how different people are. So one last thing I want to throw in here, I had to talk about delayed gratification if I'm talking about cognitive control, because it's really interesting work as well, more on the behavioral side of things. But obviously there's neurocorrelates. So this research, it kind of started in the 60s and 70s, and there's a number of different ways that these delayed gratification tests were run. But basically these ones that these researchers followed up with 30 years later is that they put these 4-year-olds in a room, in a research environment, and they told them, you can have a treat now. Sometimes they were like, you can have a treat now. Or they said something along the lines of the longer you wait before you ring a bell or you call me, the bigger your reward will be. Okay, so delayed gratification, right? So y'all have delayed gratification right now with your degree. Like, can you put in 4 years to get your degree? You're delaying your gratification to the end in order to get a bigger reward. That's a bit of delayed gratification, okay? So the longer a kid could wait before consuming the reward or calling on the researcher to get the other reward, we would say that they had a longer delay. They could wait longer to be gratified, okay? Which is obviously going to be very different than someone with impulsivity, where they want the gratification right now, okay? Can someone delay time until they get gratified? Okay, so these experiments happened in the 60s and 70s, and then they followed up with these kids. And what I find really fascinating is that 30 years when they followed up with these kids, is they found that kids that had a higher delay gratification score, okay, so they could wait longer before getting a reward, those students who had a higher delay gratification score tended to have a lower BMI. And the exact number that they found, each additional minute that a preschooler delayed gratification, this is crazy to me. Each additional minute that a preschooler delayed gratification predicted a 0.2 point reduction in BMI in adulthood. So let's say, so put that in context, let's say that this 4-year-old, this preschooler, instead of waiting 1 minute, they waited 5 minutes. That 5-minute delay in gratification at age 4 to get a particular reward related to a 1-point decrease in BMI later on in life. And again, this brings me to the question of how much control do we really have on these things, right? Is control something that we are totally in control of? We get into philosophical debates about this. We get into conversations about willpower and how much control we have over our lives. Really interesting stuff. And I do believe we have control over our lives to a point. But are we really saying that there's something wrong with a 4-year-old who wasn't able to resist waiting to that? Is that something wrong with them? Right? And I bring this up because I think we have a lot of moral judgments around individuals that have a hard time resisting rewards or resisting food or resisting drugs, but is there something going on more neurologically or maybe behaviorally or maybe epigenetically, maybe genetically, right? That predisposes someone to want a reward more sooner, seek out a reward more sooner, right? And unsurprisingly, if someone has that greater desire to seek out that reward, it's unsurprising how that could relate to appetite, to food-seeking behavior, and to obesity as well. So I just found this last study really interesting to kind of put another layer on this, this unit on non-homeostatic appetite. But to add one last layer, promise you I'll do it in the next unit. In the next unit, we're going to come back and talk about how emotions and mood and memories and those things can also be part of non-homeostatic appetite and play a role in obesity as well. So I'll see you then.